Auch von mir herzlich willkommen und ich freue mich auf die nächsten 2 Tage mit Ihnen und euch allen. Und ich möchte direkt anfangen und die erste Person begrüßen. Das ist Sylvie Lindeperg. Sie ist Historikerin und Autorin, auch Professorin an der Sorbonne-Universität. In ihrer Forschung konzentriert sie sich vor allem auf die Verbindung von Kino und Erinnerung und hat quasi einen speziellen Fokus auf den Zweiten Weltkrieg und internationale Gerichtsbarkeit. Heute hören wir quasi einen Vortrag zu ihrem aktuellen Buch Nuremberg, Battle of the Images. Herzlich willkommen. Welcome.
Guten Morgen. Thank you for your presentation and also thank you to Michel for her invitation. Also, I'd like to apologize for having to speak in English. Ich habe die deutsche Sprache in der Schule gelernt, aber ich habe alles vergessen. So, Entschuldigung. So my book, Nuremberg, the Battle of Images, looks at the staging, the filming, and the storytelling of the international trial, which, as you know, opened on the 20th November 1945 and lasted 10 months. And so I will focus here on the film footage of the trial. My aim is really to analyze these images along two main lines. First of all, I will study the history of the shooting and the way in which it was conceived. The images of Nuremberg, as you will see, reveal the concepts of justice and law held by three teams of cameramen whose co-presence in the courtroom was one of the original features of the trial. In this sense, the forms of filming raise political, ethical, and philosophical issues. Then I will show what these shots reveal about the course of the trial in relation to the written minutes, which they supplement and sometimes correct. So it was in June 1945 that the Attorney General of the United States, Robert Jackson, decided to film the international trial that he was overseeing. This idea came from his right-hand man, William Donovan. Donovan was a brilliant and, let's say, whimsical general, and he was the head of the US intelligence agency, the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. And he envisaged Nuremberg as a huge media event show that would offer the world, and here I quote Donovan, the greatest moral tale that has ever been told. For the Americans, the trial was not just about judging the Nazis' leaders, but also about constructing a narrative about the war and about justice. And in this sense, the trial imagined by the Americans falls into the category of liberal show trials. We owe this notion to the jurist Marc Oziel, who defines the liberal show trial as a trial whose stakes go beyond the question of the fate of the accused to pursue political, moral, educational, and memorial goals. And these goals transform the courtroom into a kind of theater of ideas. Oziel defined this show trial as liberal in that they differ from those of the totalitarian regimes in their respect for the rights of the defense. From May 1945, the Americans launched a highly ambitious information campaign to promote their vision of war, their concept of justice, and the values of their democracy. And cinema played a leading role thanks to the field photographic branch, the film section that John Ford had created in 1941 within the OSS. The tasks given to his team were numerous. The fourth section had to seek out and assemble images proving the Nazi crimes, make a short film to prepare public opinion for the opening of the trial, record the hearings, and produce a documentary drawing the lessons from the judgment. Let's move now on to the development of the filming project. And to understand its meaning, I need to recall some major legal and cinematographic tradition of the four member countries of the International Tribunal. First, the idea of filming the trial was not obvious for the Americans. In 1937, the United States had banned cameras from its courtroom following the media outburst of the trial of Bruno Hauptmann. Hauptmann was the murderer of the Lindeperg's couple child. And in doing so, America followed the example of Great Britain, which had banned all filming in its court since 1925. On the French side now, newsreels operator filmed the hearings of the most high-profile trials using only silent cameras. So of the four member countries of the tribunal, only the USSR had a solid tradition of filming dating back to the 90s. And so I'm going to retrace very quickly the main figures in this tradition. From the very beginnings of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet authorities ordered the recording of certain political trials in order to extend their educational virtues. For instance, in 1922, Tsiga Vertov filmed the trial of 12 socialist revolutionaries in Moscow. A few years later, the Stalinist period set the rules for the Soviet trial film genre for a long time to come. First, spectacularization of justice, but also a litany of conviction, the central role given to the public and the press as actors in the drama. The operators also played the role of auxiliaries to justice. Their cameras were on view and their spotlight shone mercilessly on the accused, trying to make them guilty even before the judgment. You have here an example. These powerful lights also swept through the ranks of the public, most of whom were party members invited to take part in the trial, applauding in particular when the sentences were handed down. Then came the war, and in 1943, the Kremlin decided to organize public trial of Nazi criminals and give them extensive media coverage. This was the case with the Kharkov trial held in December 1943 in the city theater against 3 German officers and their Russian collaborator. All 4 were sentenced to death and hanged. The trial was extensively filmed by Ilya Kopalin, and in his film Sud Edet, which could be translated as the court is meeting or something like this, we find a main topoi of the genre, topoi that you will see later in Losnitsa, a film about the Kiev trial. The courtroom is transformed, as you can see here, into a cinema set. The drama is built around the confessions of the defendants. The camera angle highlights the power of the president and the prosecutor. The press and the spectators are filmed extensively. Yet, the images of the public reveal the evolution of Soviet justice. If the spectators are still members of the party, they were subjected to the Nazi occupation and suffer the crime judged in the courtroom, which are no longer imaginary. The cameramen alternate between long shots and close-up portraits of the spectators, their faces tense with listening and marked by grief. The final outstanding feature of Sudidette is the hanging that concluded the film. In May 1945, Field Photo viewed the film and was very impressed by its dramatic power and formal qualities. Ford's team drew on it in a preparatory document for the filming of the Nuremberg hearings. This note of intent, probably written by Ford himself, reveals the ambition of Field Photo. First, they want their images to highlight the virtues of the American judicial model and to serve the cause of the United States. Their second ambition was formal. The memo cites the Sudidette model and draws inspiration from some of its figures. For instance, the operator will film the spectators and journalists at work at length. They will also highlight the prosecutors. But the Field Photo also draws from the Hollywood court drama and their judicial imaginary, and more specifically from John Ford's Young Mr. Lincoln. Unlike the Soviet cameraman, the American imagine a trial with a lot of suspense and fierce duels between the defense and the accusation attorneys. The plan to film the Nuremberg trial also borrowed its filming methods from Hollywood cinema. The memo even goes so far as to disregard the constraints of filming live in a court of law. The authors pretend to ignore the fact that they won't be able to redraw the scenic space as Ford did in the studio sets of Young Mr. Lincoln. The trial imagined by Field Photo is therefore underpinned by a strong cinematic philosophy. The aim is to compete with the Soviets on their own ground, but also to surpass them with the weapon of Hollywood fiction. In this sense, this approach to filming was perfectly in line with Donovan's prosecution strategy, who wanted to model the dramaturgy of the trial on the style of American criminal cases and make it most spectacular. And in order to attract the attention of the press, he suggests that Jackson entrust the witnesses with the story of Nazi criminality. According to Donovan, this being of flesh and blood will embody the great American moral tale on stage. But the OSS dream was shattered in September 1945. The task of filming the trial was taken away from the Field Photo and given to the military operators of the Signal Corps. At the same time, Donovan was entering a turbulent period at Nuremberg. By the end of the summer of 1945, the American prosecution had assembled a wealth of documentation, much of it produced by the Third Reich. And this unexpected crop led Jackson to review his prosecution strategy. Instead of basing his drama on witness statement, as Donovan had wanted, Jackson decided to focus his case on Nazi writings. In his view, these documents constituted less fallible evidence than witness statements. The Signal Corps filming methods were in sync with this new and more documentary conception of the trial. The military cameraman favored the constitution of archives over cinematographic creation. At the same time, the newsreels company were also gaining access to the courtroom, but not without difficulties. At first, Jackson, haunted by the media circus of the Lindeperg versus Hauptmann trial, did not want newsreels cameramen in the courtroom. But with the American film pressed up in arms, the newsreels company were finally authorized to appoint a cameraman, only one, for each country. These images would be pooled with those of the Signal Corps. But the Soviet Union refused to compromise. It demanded that its operators shoot in parallel with those of the Signal Corps under the direction of the famous cameraman Roman Carmen, who had been commissioned to make a film about Nuremberg in the tradition of Südedet. The recording of the Nuremberg hearings was therefore carried out by operators from a variety of backgrounds who pursued very different goals. The Signal Corps leaned toward documentary filming with a view to building up archives. The American, French, and British newsreels wanted to satisfy their audiences by focusing on the most dramatic and spectacular moments. Finally, Carmen's work was part of the long tradition of Soviet trial films. As soon as the debates opened, the film crew realized the obstacles to their freedom of action. The cameraman could not move freely around the room. In fact, to protect the tribunal from any kind of disorder, Jackson ordered the building of glass boxes in which the cameramen were confined. Here you see the first camera set up at the back of the room next to the press seats. The second was hidden in the false walls, and the third was in an open space and was only for mute cameras, at least at the beginning of the trial. The cameramen were also handicapped by lighting problems. While the powerful projectors dazzled the eyes and overheated the room, the British Judge President Lawrence demanded that the cameraman ask his permission to switch them on. This decision gave him a formidable hold over the filming. And Lawrence used this power throughout the trial, frequently having the projector switch off at the most intense moment of the proceeding, which obviously did not suit well the operators and particularly the newsreels cameramen who were furious. So, as you can see, the rigors of Anglo-American judicial ethics combined with technical difficulties complicated the filming of Nuremberg. And in the face of adversity, the camera crews did not display the same inventiveness. The newsreels company's filming soon proved to be inadequate. The cameramen were not only hampered by technical constraints, they were also disappointed by the way the trial was going. The first few weeks of the hearings were devoted to the presentation of the American prosecution case. And instead of the huge show they had hoped for, Jackson offered them the parade of prosecutors who took turns at the lecterns to read endlessly Nazi documents in a dull tone. The hope for moral drama turned into a monument to boredom, to quote the British writer Rebecca West. The press, both film and print, deserted the courtroom. The official American and Soviet teams were far more assiduous. but their images reflect radically different philosophies of justice and cinema. To film the US prosecutors, the Signal Corps had installed its main sound camera in the glass booth at the back of the room. The military insisted on neutral and objective recording. They wanted to reproduce the vision of a spectator sitting at the back and looking around the stage. But this choice had the major disadvantage of filming the American prosecutor from behind. Here you can see Jackson, and maybe we can listen the beginning of its opening statement.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility.
Moreover, neutrality often turned to passivity. Enclosed in their glass cage as if in a bubble, the Americans showed little interest or reaction to the details of the play. Take, for example, their recording of the testimony of General Lausen, a high-ranking Abwehr officer, who testified against the defendants. And at the beginning of his examination, the American prosecutor asked him to recognize and to point the defendants Ribbentrop, Jodl, and Keitel. On 3 occasions, the witness accompanied his answer with a gesture, pointing the hand in the direction of the box. But the operator did not attempt the slightest span, even though he had the technical possibility to do so. The camera remained fixed on the witness, while the whole audience had turned its gaze toward the 3 defendants. And here you can see in the white circle the Russian stenographer who had looked up from his paper, observed Lausen's arm, and then directed his gaze toward the defendants. The fixity of the frame left part of the action off screen. And this fragmentation of space betrays the elusive promise of an objective recording. In the courtroom, or let's say in a courtroom, the camera diffuses the togetherness of the actors gathered on stage. And yet, this co-presence of the protagonist constitutes, according to Emmanuel Levinas, the very essence of justice in action. Let's move to the Soviets. The Soviets, for their part, were not at all concerned about the objectivity of the filming, but their images bear witness to their great skill. The Russian team had to remain faithful to the Soviet film genre while at the same time innovating in order to portray a trial in which they could master neither the codes nor the course. And after a short adaptation phase, Carmen nevertheless found solutions. And when the Soviet prosecutor general Roman Rudenko took the stand in February, his team was ready. Throughout the speech, the Russians showed their talent and ingenuity, crossing their cameras and reacting to every movement in the courtroom. Their main innovation was the installation of their main sound camera in the corner position. These images were, as you can see, far more flattering than those taken by the Signal Corps behind Jackson's back. In contrast with the American recording, the Russian filming is perfectly coherent. Unlike their counterparts, the Soviet cameramen were given precise instruction as part of a shoot carefully planned by Carmen, who anticipated the shape of his feature film. But the filmmaker was not content to simply record the event. He sometimes recreated it for the purpose of his documentary. And I will give you two examples. On the morning of 7th December, the Soviet team obtained permission to enter the courtroom to film the entrance of the accused. It was in a way, let's say, a catch-up session, as Carmen had missed the opening of the trial because his plane had been grounded in Berlin by the fog. The Signal Corps, therefore, authorized him to film the defendants entering the box to recreate this seminal scene in Soviet court films. And as these photographs show, the Russian film under the gaze of their American counterparts. Really, the Soviets took advantage of the situation to spread out in the courtroom outside the reserved areas. And here at the bottom of the image, you can see Carmen. Carmen winding up the spring on his little haymow. In the next shots, Carmen approached the box to film the defendant in close-up. And here is a short extract of what he filmed. This session was so successful that the Soviets repeated the experiment, often filming their journalists and cartoonists at work between sessions. And these scenes enabled them to break the monotonous static of the audience shots. During a break time, Carmen and his cameraman filmed here the cartoonist from the Kukrinsky group. But they went even further. Carmen asked the Russian prosecutor to reenact their part again in the empty courtroom. Here you see that in the reconstructed shot, the light bulbs that were used to alert speakers who spoke too quickly. But these bulbs were not installed when Rudenko took the stand. They were installed a few days after. In a letter to his editor, Carmen explained that his aim was to correct the sound defects in the original footage. The Russian prosecutors had been forced to slow down their speech to facilitate the work of the interpreters who were translating simultaneously. As you may know, it was a big first. Carmen gave them the opportunity to reread their text at normal speed with the right rhythm and tone. But this reenactment also enabled him to place the camera under the lectern to capture the speakers in a slight low angle. This shot, which exalted the power of the Soviet prosecutors, were really in keeping with the canons of the genre. Also, as you can see here, the beginning of the real speech had lost some of its solemnity due to this journalist moving behind Rudenko. So the Russian team was not content to simply script reality on the sidelines of the hearings. It substituted a more powerful fiction. Carmen edited these images into the film The People's Court, which was released in the USSR in November 1946, just a few weeks after the verdict was handed down. And this film is brilliant in form, but very questionable in content. Carmen rewrites the history of Nuremberg to the sole benefit of the Soviet prosecution. Thanks to ingenious editing and a highly biased commentary, the film reenacts the courtroom drama to ensure the unqualified triumph of the Russian prosecutors. Rudenko is seen leading the proceedings, while his Western colleagues are reduced to the role of pale and mute extras. The Soviet prosecution benefits from the expressive power of the reconstructed scenes. And so, even though the trial had turned into a fiasco for the USSR, particularly on the issue of the German-Soviet Pact, Carmen recreated on screen the trial that the Kremlin had dreamed of. He gave his country back control over a trial whose course and outcome had been completely out of its hands. And the triumph was all the more clear-cut, given that the Americans' documentary project was blocked up until January 1949 due to their internal quarrels. In the end, the American film, was only released in Germany in the highly inopportune context of the Berlin blockade. And so, to Jackson's great despair, the American innovation in images had not lived up to their promise. The Russians had won the battle of the screens. This brings me very quickly to my last point on the contribution of images to an understanding of how the trial unfolded. While the minutes and written archives are an essential source for historians, audio and film recordings are a very useful complement. First, they shed light on the condition in which the judicial word is spoken and offer a more sensitive experience of the hearings. For instance, Nuremberg footage reveals that the sound interference was even more impressive with the tribunal working in a permanent hub. The audio and film recordings of the hearings also reveal the discrepancy between the translation heard and their written transcription. It shows, for instance, the extent of the rewriting work undertaken with the help of the interpreters, who very often visited the reviewing room to improve their translation and to correct their mistakes. As you can imagine, this series of corrections raises very important legal and archival questions. The rewriting work also focused on the original language, which was also reworked. As I explain in my book, the minutes erased certain sentences spoken at the hearings. The committee responsible for the minute also recommended, and for instance, the deletion of all slips of the tongue. Nor did the transcripts record non-verbal expressions such as murmurs and laughter. Some of these were essential to the course of the trial. I will show you the record of Göring's laughter when a document on the Anschluss was read out, showing him in a scene with Ribbentrop. The images of Nuremberg also show us bodies listening and speaking, with gesture, glances and silences that are absent from the minutes and that give flesh and blood to the hearings. I'm going to give you a brief glimpse of this about the testimony of Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier. This former member of the resistance who was deported to Auschwitz made a great impression on the stand. Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier was the first woman to speak out in the ultra-masculine world of Nuremberg. She was also a high-profile figure, at the time communist deputy in the Constituent Assembly. The footage of her deposition shed light on the way she became the face and moral figure of the trial. First, the narrative is striking in its determination to give back to each of her companions her name, her identity, her story, and the account of her death, so that she will live on in collective memory. Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier did not come before the tribunal to recount her own ordeal. She spoke as a survivor who, in the words of Primo Levi, testified on behalf of third parties in the name of a drowned. The images give us a better understanding of the meaning of these words. As soon as Marie-Claude enters the courtroom, we see the determination and the strength of the witness wearing the Legion of Honor ribbon in her lapel. We can see clearly that she presents herself as a fighter, not as a victim. Everyone senses a determination to fight back. The audiovisual recording also shows that Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, who was fluent in English, German and Russian, sometimes replied directly in the language of the interviewer. You will see that she replied here very harshly to the president of the court, Justice Lawrence.
Elle est morte au bout de 15 jours à Auschwitz. One moment.
Moins vite, s'il vous plaît.
When you said that only 49 came back, did you mean that only 49 arrived at Auschwitz?
No, only 49 came back to France.
Oh, France. Go on.
As you can see, Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier was annoyed by the constant questions of the president, and this interruption, which she felt were often pointless. On her return to Paris, she criticized the excessive formalism of the trial, which she thought was too slow and sclerotic. When she left the stand, as you will see now, her gaze was one of victory and revenge. Then, while walking along the dock, Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier turned her head towards the defendants and stared at them as she walked. The countershot is provided by the French journalist Madeleine Jacob. I quote, "When she passed by a few meters from them, the defendants lowered their eyes. Only Goering continued to watch the slim outline of these survivors whose accusation would weigh heavily at the end of the rope he would soon be hanged on." On her return to France, Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier explained, and again I quote, "I wanted to see up close how these men could have been capable of committing such crimes. And at the same time, I wanted them to see me, and that it was through my eyes that millions of victims, men and women and children, were seeing and judging them." I will now read to conclude what I wrote in my book about this scene. To look at a look is to look at something which cannot be abandoned or freed, but something which is aimed at you, wrote Emmanuel Levinas. Raleigh was a directly look more profound and spectral than in this fleeting instant, when one woman's eyes contain those of all those assassinated. For the camera, the exchange lasted 5 seconds. 5 seconds of eternity. Thank you.